Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we dive into narratives that touch your heart and explore the resilience of the human spirit. Today, we bring you the extraordinary journey of Madison, a girl who wakes from a 5-year coma only to confront memories that unravel a web of secrets, fear, and hope. Stay tuned. The hospital room was bathed in an artificial glow, the kind that seemed to strip away any sense of warmth or comfort. Machines beeped rhythmically, their sound a reminder of the fragile line that separated life from something else. Madison lay motionless on the stark white bed, her auburn hair spread like a halo across the pillow. To an outsider, she might have looked peaceful, as if caught in the depth of a long, undisturbed sleep. But her parents, Laura and James, knew the truth was far more harrowing. Laura clutched a worn teddy bear tightly against her chest as she sat in the cramped waiting area just outside the room. The bear's fur was patchy, its eyes dulled from years of wear. Yet it was a tangible connection to a time when Madison was just a vibrant, curious girl. James paced back and forth, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, the lines on his face etched with years of worry and sleepless nights. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the burden of hope and despair interwoven like an unrelenting thread. 5 years. It had been 5 years since their lives had come to a screeching halt, leaving them suspended in a limbo of unanswered prayers. "How much longer do we have to wait?" James asked, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. He turned to Laura, his tone laced with both frustration and desperation. "How long can this go on?" Laura's grip on the bear tightened. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was a steady resolve beneath her words. "As long as it takes." "James, she's still in there. I know she is. We have to believe in her. Madison is a fighter." James wanted to believe her. He wanted to share the faith that burned so brightly in his wife's heart. But the years had eroded his own sense of hope. The quiet anguish of watching their daughter lie unresponsive day after day had taken its toll. His gaze flickered toward the door to Madison's room, where Dr. Carter was performing another round of checks. James had lost count of how many times he had seen that door open and close, the doctor emerging with the same grave expression. The door clicked softly as Dr. Carter stepped into the hallway, his face calm but serious. Laura and James both stood, the weight of their expectations pressing down on the space between them. "I've just finished checking her vitals," Dr. Carter said, his voice steady. "Everything remains stable. That's a good sign. We just need to continue being patient." "Patient?" James's voice rose slightly, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's been 5 years. Doctor, how much longer can we wait?" Laura reached for his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "James," she said softly, "Madison needs us to be strong for her. She needs to feel our love, even if she can't respond." Dr. Carter nodded in agreement. "She may not be able to communicate, but it's possible she can hear you. Emotional support is critical. It could make all the difference." James let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own helplessness. He glanced back into the room, his heart aching as he took in the sight of Madison's still form. Once a lively teenager who filled their home with laughter, she now seemed like a shadow of herself, beautiful in her vulnerability, but heartbreakingly distant. Inside the room, Laura settled into the chair by Madison's bedside, her trembling fingers reaching to brush a strand of hair from her daughter's face. She spoke softly, her words flowing like a river of memories. "Madison, sweetheart," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "Do you remember our trips to the lake? You used to love catching fireflies. You said the water looked like it was sprinkled with diamonds." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, hoping her words could bridge the gap between them. "I miss that smile of yours. I miss hearing you laugh. We all do." The quiet hum of machines filled the room, a stark counterpoint to the emotion in Laura's voice. James lingered in the doorway, his heart torn between staying strong and giving in to the wave of grief that threatened to overtake him. Dr. Carter observed from the hallway, his mind a careful balance of compassion and clinical curiosity. There was something about Madison's case that felt different. something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He watched as Laura's words seemed to fill the sterile space with an almost palpable warmth, and he couldn't help but hope that they might reach the young woman lying so still. Then, something remarkable happened. Madison's eyelids fluttered, so faintly it could have been mistaken for a trick of the light. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Madison," she whispered, leaning forward. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" James rushed to her side, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice a mix of hope and fear. Dr. Carter was already moving, stepping quickly into the room as Madison's eyes opened fully. They were wide, filled with confusion and something else, something deeper. Madison took a sharp, gasping breath, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to process the flood of sensations around her. Laura clasped her hand, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God! Madison, you're awake," she said, her voice trembling with joy. For the first time in years, Madison's eyes met hers. But as she looked around the room, a flicker of fear crossed her face, and her gaze settled on Dr. Carter. There was a heaviness in her expression, a weight that none of them could yet comprehend. The long silence was over. But what Madison was about to say would shatter the fragile hope her family had clung to for so long. The nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Madison's breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts as she struggled to focus on the faces around her. Her mother's tear-streaked expression, her father's tense gaze, and the steady presence of Dr. Carter blurred together in the bright, sterile light of the hospital room. Her body felt alien, as though she had been dropped into a shell she didn't recognize. She clutched at the thin blanket draped over her, the fabric offering little solace against the tide of emotions rising within her. "Madison, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Laura asked, her voice trembling as she reached for her daughter's hand. Madison blinked, her vision sharpening as her mother's warm touch anchored her to the present. I can hear you," Madison said, her voice hoarse and cracking, as if it were emerging from a deep cavern. Her words, though faint, sent a wave of relief through the room. Laura sobbed quietly, clutching Madison's hand tighter, while James remained frozen, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hope. "It's okay," Dr. Carter said gently, stepping closer to the bed. His calm, measured tone was like a steady thread pulling Madison back from the edge. "You've been through a lot. Take your time." Madison nodded faintly, her eyes darting between them. Her mind felt like a shattered mirror, fragments of memories glittering just out of reach. She wanted to speak, to explain the flickers of images that haunted her, but every attempt to piece them together felt overwhelming. "What happened?" she whispered finally, her voice tinged with confusion and fear. Laura leaned forward, brushing Madison's hair away from her face. "You had an accident. Honey, you've been asleep for a long time. 5 years. James added quietly, his voice strained. The words hung heavy in the air, their weight pressing down on all of them. Madison's eyes widened as she processed the enormity of it. 5 years. 5 years of silence, of being disconnected from the world she once knew. Her chest tightened as questions tumbled through her mind. How had she ended up here? Why couldn't she remember? Dr. Carter stepped in, his professional demeanor tempered with compassion. "Madison, sometimes our minds protect us by hiding painful memories. It's okay if you don't remember everything right away. What's important is that you take things slowly. You're safe now." Safe. The word echoed in her mind, but it didn't feel true. Beneath the relief of waking up lay a shadow, a gnawing unease she couldn't shake. A faint image flickered in her memory, an argument, loud voices, and a sense of overwhelming dread. She clenched her hands into fists, her breathing growing more rapid as the sensation of fear bubbled to the surface. "Madison, are you all right?" Laura asked, alarmed by the change in her daughter's expression. Madison shook her head slightly, as if trying to dispel the fog clouding her thoughts. I remember something," she said hesitantly, her voice barely audible. Laura and James exchanged a tense glance, while Dr. Carter leaned closer, his attention fully on her. "What do you remember?" he asked, his tone gentle but intent. Madison closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus on the fragments swirling in her mind. There was yelling. She began slowly, her words shaky. "Two people arguing. I think one of them was Dad." James stiffened, his jaw tightening as he exchanged another glance with Laura. "Madison," he said carefully, "are you sure? Maybe your memories are a little mixed up right now." But Madison shook her head, the fear in her voice growing. "No, I remember. You were there, Dad, and someone else, someone angry." Her brow furrowed as she struggled to grasp the fleeting images. It didn't feel like an accident. Something was wrong. Dr. Carter's calm demeanor didn't falter, though his expression grew more serious. "Madison, it's okay. These memories might come back in pieces, and they might feel confusing at first. What's important is that you take your time." "No!" Madison's voice cracked, and her hands gripped the blanket tightly. "I need to know. I need to understand what happened. It doesn't make sense. I don't feel safe." I didn't feel safe then either." Laura placed a soothing hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We'll figure it out, Maddie. Together. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Dr. Carter stepped back slightly, his mind racing with the implications of Madison's words. He had seen cases where trauma distorted reality, but there was a clarity to Madison's fear that couldn't be dismissed. He would need to tread carefully, balancing the need to uncover the truth with the need to protect her fragile state. As the room fell into a tense silence, Madison's gaze shifted to her father. Her voice was quiet but firm when she spoke again. "Dad, what happened that day?" James opened his mouth to reply but hesitated, his eyes darting toward Dr. Carter as if searching for an escape. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he muttered, "I don't know what you're talking about, Maddie. It was just an accident." Madison's heart sank, but her resolve hardened. Deep down, she knew he wasn't telling the whole truth. Something terrible had happened, and she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the answers buried in her fractured memory. Madison lay in the hospital bed, her chest tightening as her father's evasive response replayed in her mind. The weight of his words, or lack thereof, pressed heavily on her. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his uneven tone. He was hiding something. Her fragmented memories were like scattered pieces of a puzzle. And while some parts were blurred, others were sharp and vivid, cutting through the haze. That argument, the anger, the fear, she couldn't shake it. Her father had been there, and so had someone else, a figure whose face remained shrouded in shadows. Dr. Carter's quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "Madison, we'll give you some time to rest. Try not to push yourself too hard. Memory can be a tricky thing, especially after trauma." Madison nodded faintly, but rest felt impossible. As Dr. Carter led her parents out of the room, she turned her head to the side, staring out the window. The late afternoon sunlight bathed the room in a golden glow, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her heart. She closed her eyes, willing herself to remember, to make sense of the swirling images and emotions. What had happened that day? And why did it feel like the truth was just out of reach? Meanwhile, in the hallway, Dr. Carter faced Laura and James. Their expressions were tight. Laura's filled with concern, and James's tinged with something harder to read. Madison's memories may continue to return in fragments. Dr. Carter said carefully, "It's important that we approach this with sensitivity. She needs to feel supported, not pressured." "Of course," Laura said quickly, her voice trembling. "We'll do whatever it takes to help her." James, however, crossed his arms and shifted uncomfortably. "You don't think she's confused? I mean, 5 years is a long time. Memories can distort." Dr. Carter's gaze didn't waver. "That's possible, but it's also possible that her memories are accurate. The human mind is remarkable. Sometimes, it protects us by hiding painful truths until we're ready to face them." James's jaw tightened, and Laura glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "James, what's going on?" she asked softly. "You've been acting strange ever since she woke up." Strange? James snapped, his voice rising. I've been holding this family together for 5 years while she was in a coma. And now you think I'm the problem? Dr. Carter intervened, his tone calm but firm. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding. Madison mentioned hearing an argument before her accident. She believes you were involved. James's face turned pale, his defensive posture stiffening further. That's ridiculous, he said quickly. She was a teenager. She's mixing things up. Laura's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer to him. James, you're deflecting. What aren't you telling us? James threw up his hands, his frustration spilling over. I've told you everything I know. It was an accident. That's it. Can't we just focus on helping her recover? Dr. Carter observed the exchange carefully, noting the subtle cracks in James's demeanor. There was something there, something he wasn't saying. I think it's important we address these concerns openly. Dr. Carter said gently, Madison needs clarity. And so do you. James muttered something under his breath and turned away, his movements stiff and abrupt. Laura stared after him, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. Later that evening, Laura found herself sitting alone in the hospital's dimly lit cafeteria, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea. Her mind raced with questions, doubts creeping in like shadows. James's reaction had unsettled her. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he was telling the truth. But Madison's words and the tension in his voice told a different story. Dr. Carter appeared quietly at her side, his presence both steady and reassuring. May I join you? He asked. Laura nodded, grateful for the distraction. I don't know what to think anymore, Laura admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. James says it was an accident. But Madison seems so certain, and he's acting so defensive. It's not like him. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, his tone measured. It's not uncommon for people to react defensively when they're confronted with difficult truths. But it's also important to trust your instincts. If there's more to the story, we'll uncover it. Madison's recovery depends on it. Laura stared into her tea, her thoughts swirling. She was such a happy girl, she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. Before the accident, she loved going to the park, riding her bike, spending time with her friends. I just don't understand how things could have gone so wrong. Dr. Carter hesitated before speaking. Sometimes, the most painful truths are hidden in plain sight. Madison mentioned another person in the argument. Do you have any idea who it could have been? Laura shook her head slowly, her brow furrowing. No, but there was this boy from the neighborhood. They weren't close, but she mentioned him once or twice. I think his name was Ryan. He was older, a bit of a troublemaker. James didn't like her talking to him. Dr. Carter's expression tightened. Did James ever confront him? I don't know, Laura admitted, her voice wavering. He never said anything to me, but now I'm starting to wonder. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. It might be worth looking into. Sometimes the answers lie in the people who are closest to us. As Laura's mind raced with new questions, Dr. Carter excused himself, his determination renewed. Madison's memories were slowly piecing themselves together, and the picture they painted was growing darker. To uncover the truth, he would need to dig deeper into the relationships and secrets that surrounded her life before the accident. Whatever had happened that day, it was clear that Madison's journey toward recovery was only just beginning. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, Madison stared blankly at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled. The fragments of her memory were unsettling: an argument, her father's raised voice, and the presence of someone she couldn't identify. Her frustration mounted with every passing moment. She needed answers, but every attempt to force her memories felt like trying to catch smoke with her hands. Dr. Carter entered her room, clipboard in hand, his steady gaze calming her restless mind. Good morning, Madison. How are you feeling today? He asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. I don't know, Madison admitted. I'm scared. I keep thinking about what I saw, but it doesn't make sense. It's like there are pieces missing, and no one will tell me the truth. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. Memories after trauma can be tricky, but sometimes talking to people who were part of your life can help fill in the gaps. I spoke to your mom yesterday, and she mentioned your friend Chloe. Would you be okay if I reached out to her? Madison hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Chloe. She hadn't thought about her best friend in so long. The name stirred faint, bittersweet memories of laughter, whispered secrets, and carefree days. Do you think she could help? She asked, her voice tentative. She might, Dr. Carter said gently. It's worth a try. By afternoon, Dr. Carter had arranged a meeting with Chloe at a small cafe near the hospital. Madison waited anxiously in her room, her thoughts a storm of anticipation and fear. When Dr. Carter returned, his expression was contemplative, the weight of his conversation with Chloe evident. Chloe told me about some things that happened before your accident. He began carefully. She mentioned you had been scared, that you felt like someone was watching you. Madison's breath caught, and her pulse quickened. I remember that, she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I was imagining it, but I wasn't. I knew someone was there. Dr. Carter leaned forward, his tone calm but intent. Did you ever tell Chloe who it was or why you felt that way? Madison's brows knitted together as she searched her fragmented memories. A face flickered in her mind, shadowed and indistinct. There was a boy. I think his name was Ryan. She said haltingly. He lived nearby. My dad didn't like him. I don't know why, but he told me to stay away. Dr. Carter's gaze sharpened. Do you think Ryan might have been involved in the argument you heard? Madison shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. I don't know. I just remember feeling so scared that day. It wasn't just Ryan. It was something bigger, something I couldn't understand. Dr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on hers. It's okay, Madison. We'll figure this out together. You're not alone. As Madison nodded, a spark of determination lit within her. She wasn't ready to give up. Not until she uncovered the truth hidden in the shadows of her past. Later that evening, Madison sat upright in her hospital bed, her thoughts a relentless tide of uncertainty. Her father's face lingered in her mind, the flicker of defensiveness she had seen earlier etched in her memory. He was hiding something, she was sure of it. The question was why. Every fragmented image and strained silence only deepened her resolve to confront him. The door opened, and James entered, his footsteps hesitant. He carried a paper coffee cup, but his hand trembled slightly as he placed it on the small table by her bed. Hey, Maddie, he said, his voice uneven. How are you feeling? Madison studied him carefully, her gaze unwavering. Dad, I need you to be honest with me, she said, her tone steady but firm. What happened the day of the accident? James froze, his eyes darting briefly to the floor before meeting hers. Madison, I told you it was just an accident. You were riding your bike. It was a terrible mistake. No, Madison interrupted, her voice rising. That's not the whole story. And you know it. I remember the argument. I remember you and someone else. You were angry, and I was scared. James's jaw tightened, his composure beginning to crack. Maddie, you've been through a lot. Maybe your mind is playing tricks on you. Madison clenched her fists, her frustration spilling over. Stop lying to me. Dad, I deserve the truth. Who were you arguing with that day? The tension in the room grew thick, suffocating. James took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. I was trying to protect you, he said finally, his voice breaking. That's all I've ever wanted. Protect me from what? Madison demanded, her eyes glistening with tears. From who? James hesitated, his face contorted with inner conflict. It was Ryan, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you around him. I thought he was dangerous. Madison's heart raced as the name confirmed what had been swirling in her mind. What happened? She pressed. Why were you fighting? James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. He was hanging around our street, watching you. I confronted him that day. We argued. I told him to stay away from you. That's all. I didn't think. His voice faltered, and his expression darkened. I didn't think it would go that far. What do you mean, go that far? Madison asked, her voice trembling. What did he do? Before James could answer, the door swung open, and Dr. Carter entered, his calm presence a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. Is everything all right? He asked, his gaze shifting between Madison and James. "No," Madison said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I need answers, and I think my dad knows more than he's saying." James's shoulders slumped as if the weight of the room was crushing him. "I thought I could protect her," he murmured, his voice cracking. "But I failed." The truth hung in the air, heavy and unresolved, as Madison realized that this confrontation was only the beginning. The pieces of her shattered past were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than she had ever imagined. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey here at Empathy Stories. Madison's story reminds us of the power of determination, love, and the pursuit of truth even in the darkest times. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales. Together, let's continue to inspire, connect, and spread empathy to those who need it most. See you next time.